Hi everyone, dear participants. On behalf of the experts in international trade at the Chamber of Commerce of Metropolitan Montreal, we welcome you to our webinar of the Desjardins International Meeting Series. And today's topic is the overview of international financial institutions with a spotlight on the Interamerican Development Bank. My name is Dina Mansour. I am an advisor for international market development at the Chamber of Commerce of Metropolitan Montreal, and I am pleased to moderate this webinar today. So our speakers are Ms. Leah Johnston, Trade Commissioner within the Office of Liaison with International Financial Institutions at the Embassy of Canada in Washington, D.C., as well as Darren Rogers, Senior Counselor, Office of the Executive Director for Canada at the Inter-American Development Bank. So first, I would like to use this time to thank our partners, starting with Desjardins, our principal sponsor for the series, as well as our collaborators, Export Development Canada and La Presse, who made this webinar possible, and Economic Development Agency of Canada for the regions of Quebec for its ongoing support of World Trade Center Montreal's activities. So first, if you have any questions to our panelists, I invite you to write them in the designated Q&A box located on the bottom center of your screen, and we will address them towards the end of the webinar. You might ask your question in the official language of your choosing, and I will be happy to translate for you if needed. Alors, veuillez prendre note que ce webinaire est principalement en anglais. Toutefois, si vous avez des questions en français, vous pouvez nous les poser. Il nous fera plaisir de les traduire. Et d'ailleurs, un de nos panélistes, donc M. Darren Rogers, comprend très bien le français également. Also, you will receive a short survey that will pop up in your browser at the end of the webinar, which we invite you to answer to gather your opinion for future events. I will also send you a follow-up email tomorrow, which will include the presentation used today, which will be available in English as well as in French. Donc, nous allons vous envoyer les diapositives par courriel demain, qui seront disponibles en anglais ainsi qu'en français. If you'd like to watch this webinar again, we will make the recording available on our Chamber of Commerce Metropolitan website, as well as our YouTube page. At the moment, you have also a poll going on, which we invite you to answer, so we can gather more information and to see if we meet our objectives for all of our events. So let me start by introducing our first speaker, Ms. Leah Johnston. She is a trade commissioner covering the international financial institution based at the Embassy of Canada in Washington, D.C. And prior to joining the team, she was a procurement officer for 8 funded businesses with the Department for International Trade at the British Embassy in Washington. In this role, she helped UK companies navigate and find success with the World Bank Group, the Inter-American Development Bank, USAID, and the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Her first role at the British Embassy was as a business development associate for the life sciences and healthcare sector, promoting both trade and investment expansion to the UK by firms from the Mid-Atlantic. Leah graduated as well from the University of St. Andrews in 2014 with a joint degree in art, history, and international relations. So Leah, you now have the floor.
All right, thank you, Dina. And welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Leah Johnston. I'm a trade commissioner in the Office of Liaison with the International Financial Institutions. We call ourselves IFIs for short. I'm based at the Embassy of Canada in Washington, D.C., and I'm joined by my colleague, Darren Rogers, who's a senior counselor in the Office of the Executive Director for Canada at the IDB. Next slide. The agenda for today, I'm going to provide an introduction on the Trade Commissioner Service and how we support Canadian companies, and then kind of do an IFI 101 on what the IFI market is like. And then I'll be handing over to Darren, who will be talking about how Canadian companies can work with the IDB and the different arms of the IDB and some other information that is useful for businesses. We'll have a Q&A session at the end, so please send in your questions. Now I want to talk about what an IFI Trade Commissioner is. So our role is to help assess Canadian companies and their market potential for the IFIs. A large part of what we do is identify qualified key contacts within each IFI that we cover, as well as helping companies understand at which level to go in and what time it is appropriate to contact IDB staff. We can also help resolve problems that may pop up during the procurement process and also explain what the rights of a company are during the procurement process. We also coordinate Canadian participation. We had a business opportunities fair about a year and a half ago on climate smart energy solutions. We also do outreach in Canada normally, and we host side programs. Recently, we've been doing an IFI series like this webinar with the Montreal Chamber of Commerce, and we're hoping to do more webinars this year on more sector-specific opportunities. We also disseminate business opportunities where we know there's Canadian expertise or where we know Canadian companies are active. And the trade commissioners are specifically targeted on the success of Canadian companies. So it's in our interest to support you as you work with these institutions. And these are sort of the general ways that we support companies, kind of help demystify these institutions, understand how to work with them, where to find the opportunities and the information, engage with IDB and World Bank staff. But every company is different, and we are very open to, if there's something missing in that list or some type of information that you need, feel free to reach out to us and we're happy to help. Next slide. So all the OLIFIs are co-located with the major IFIs. We're a little bit different from other trade commissioners in the trade commissioner service because most trade commissioners are focused on one or two sectors, whereas we're covering institutions that range from almost any sector you can think of. So I'm covering the World Bank and the Interamerican Development Bank, as well as the two U.S. agencies for international development, USAID and the Millennium Challenge Corporation. My colleague Tammy Brathwaite is based in Bridgetown, and she covers the Caribbean Development Bank. Ulaj Kamara is based in Abidjan, covering the African Development Bank. Lily Zhu is in Beijing, covering the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is one of the newer IFIs. And Lulu LeBlanc is based in Manila, covering the Asian Development Bank. We work together frequently because we have a lot of similar clients. We host events together, and especially since the World Bank works in all those regions and co-finances on a lot of projects, we do a lot of events and other activities together. Next slide. So these are the contact details of all the OLIFIs. As Dina mentioned, we'll be sharing these presentations tomorrow. So feel free to reach out to these colleagues directly, or I'm happy to make introductions to them if you're interested in any of those institutions. And one thing that I forgot to mention is that we also cover UN agencies. So I'm covering the New York agencies, and I have colleagues in Copenhagen and Geneva covering the other UN agencies. So we can also talk to you about that process. But for this webinar, we're just talking about the IDB. Next slide. Another resource that's available for Canadian companies is the Private Sector Liaison Officer Network, also known as the PSLO network. This was a program that was started by the World Bank about 20 years ago, and it's a way to kind of formalize their interactions with the private sectors and business intermediary organizations. In Canada, we have a very active PSLO network, and our PSLO for Quebec is Dina. And essentially the role of a PSLO is similar to what OLIFIs do. It's facilitating contact with companies in their region, with the World Bank and IDB and other IFIs, kind of acting as a voice of their national private sector, disseminating IFI information and events, and coordinating participation in business opportunity fairs and other trade missions. So these are all resources that are available to Canadian companies. And it's something that a lot of people don't know about. So we kind of try to spread the word, because a lot of times companies will start to try to work with the IDB or World Bank and not know that they have these resources available to them and can help them kind of navigate these institutions. Next slide. So what is an IFI? IFIs provide financial and technical assistance to developing countries to promote economic and social development. Primarily, they fund large infrastructure, transport, energy, water and wastewater projects, but they also are very active in the healthcare, education, social sectors. Increasingly with the COVID-19 pandemic, they've been working more in the healthcare sectors, and they do that through low-cost loans, credits, and grants to client countries. And the qualification for loans versus grants is based on the income level of the country. They operate globally like the World Bank or regionally like the Interamerican Development Bank. Next slide. The membership consists of the lending countries, the donor countries, as well as the borrower member countries, which are the clients. Canada is a member of all of the major IFIs, and we're represented through an executive director or an alternate executive director. Darren's going to talk about the executive director's role a little bit later, so I will hold off. Many of the IFIs also include investment agencies such as IDB Invest or IFC for the World Bank that focus on the private sector development. They are providing not just financial assistance, but technical and advisory services, and they play a valuable role in research and development and cooperation. So I always tell companies to think of them as not only financial institutions providing loans and grants to their client countries, but they're sort of development think tanks. And many of the people that work there are experts in their field, and they're looking for new ideas or new approaches to development issues, and they're interested in what your company can do to help them solve some of these issues. Next slide. The lending is associated with well-defined projects and implementation plans with agreed upon deliverables, and there's always a measurable development outcome. The good news for business is that they're increasingly harmonized in their approach and their operating structures, and more importantly, in their procurement policies. So a lot of the lessons that you learn from the IDB and working with them, you can apply to the World Bank or the ADB. One common misconception is that firms often assume that they're working directly with the IDB. The majority of the procurement opportunities are actually under the operational procurement, which means that the borrower member countries are overseeing, implementing, and awarding the contracts, and the IDB is playing a technical and financial assistance role. There are opportunities that are directly with the IDB through corporate procurement. A lot of them are on the administrative side with IDB headquarters in Washington, but they represent typically a smaller portion versus operational. Darren will talk a little bit about more of that later. Next slide. So why should you bid on IFI projects? Well, normally companies are approaching us because they've already heard of the IDB and they might be tracking a project. But for those who are totally new to the market and trying to understand, what are the benefits of working with an IFI? I think the main benefit is that, they're providing financial assistance in over 100 developing countries that results in hundreds of projects and billions of dollars of business opportunities. They follow strict IFI procurement policies that have values like transparency, integrity, value for money, and other business-friendly principles. And it's typically seen as a less risky way to enter emerging markets, and particularly if you're in the infrastructure, transport, energy sectors. When you're looking at some of these developing markets, a lot of the projects will be financed by one of these institutions, whether you know that or not, because it's implemented by the implementing agency and country. So those are kind of the reasons of why you should bid on IFI projects. And I'll be handing over to my colleague, Darren, who will talk about what it's like to work with the IDB and some useful resources for business. But first, let me introduce him. Darren Rogers is the Senior Counselor at the Office of the Executive Director for Canada at the IDB. He was previously the Development Counselor at Canada's permanent delegation to the OECD in Paris, where he represented Canada on the OECD Development Assistance Committee. Darren has also served at the Embassy of Canada in Colombia and at Canada's mission to the Organization of American States in Washington, D.C. He has worked in development cooperation for over 20 years, primarily on inclusive growth, human rights, and governance in Latin America and Africa. He was born and raised in New Brunswick and speaks English, French, and Spanish. Darren is a great resource for companies, and we work very closely together to support Canadian companies. So very glad that he was able to join us today. And now I will hand over to you, Darren.
Great, Leah. Thanks. Thanks for that excellent introduction. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here with you today. I hope everybody is well. Bonjour tout le monde. C'est un grand plaisir pour moi d'être avec vous aujourd'hui. J'espère que tout le monde va bien. Comme Dina l'a mentionné au début, je vais faire la présentation plutôt en anglais aujourd'hui, mais nous allons circuler les diapositives après cette session en anglais et en français. Et sentez-vous très à l'aise de poser vos questions, soit en anglais ou en français ou même en espagnol. Même en portugais, on va essayer. Mais bon, thanks again, everybody, for being here. So the objectives of this presentation today, I'm just going to try to go ahead one slide. Essentially, I'm going to give an overview of the IDB Group, what it does, what its priorities are. And then I'll also talk about business opportunities and how Canadian firms can access them. Great. Maybe next slide, just to go ahead. Thank you. So when we talk about the IDB Group, we're actually talking about three arms. There's the IDB itself, the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB Invest, and IDB Lab. And the next slide will give you a bit of an overview of what each of those are. Thanks. So the IDB does lending to governments, primarily to governments of Latin America and the Caribbean. And I should say that the IDB is actually the largest provider of development finance in the region for Latin America and the Caribbean. It lends and grants more to the region than the World Bank does. So it's a really significant player. The IDB Invest is kind of its sister organization, and it focuses on lending to the private sector, so to companies in Latin America and the Caribbean. And then IDB Lab is a smaller operation in a way, but it's kind of the innovation laboratory for the IDB Group. And it actually almost acts as like a venture capital investor for smaller startups in the region, in Latin America and the Caribbean, who are looking to have a development impact. And so, you know, the three arms of the IDB Group actually work very much kind of in sync with each other. On the next slide, you'll see the IDB member countries. There are 48 of them. So 26 borrowing members and 22 non-borrowing members. And the interesting thing about the IDB is that the borrowing members actually have a small majority share of shares in the institution. So the bank is very much oriented towards the needs of the countries of the region. You'll see there as well that Canada is a member under the non-borrowing countries. And that means that Canadian firms have access to business opportunities with the IDB. On the next slide, we'll just mention really briefly the IDB Strategic Priorities. If we could move ahead to that one. Great. So essentially, the big takeaway here is that the IDB is focused on the socioeconomic development of the region. Its motto is improving lives, and it's really about that. So you'll see that, you know, the main priorities are all about development and cross-cutting themes of gender equality and diversity, climate change and environmental sustainability, and institutional capacity are all woven in there. I'd also just highlight that the IDB Group is headquartered in Washington, D.C., and that's where I'm based right now. But it does have offices in each of the borrowing member countries. So it has 26 offices in Latin America and the Caribbean. And later on in the presentation, I'll highlight how those offices can be a real resource for Canadian firms as well. If we go on to the next slide, you'll see just this is from the IDB website. So this is a breakdown of the sectors that the IDB is lending to right now. The main takeaways here are that in any given year, about 40 to 50% of the IDB's lending and grants are in the field of infrastructure. And that's infrastructure defined pretty widely, including transportation and water and sanitation and energy. And the other thing I'd highlight, you can see at the bottom of the slide there, is that the IDB has committed to a 30% climate finance floor, meaning that 30% of everything that the IDB funds has to contribute to either climate change adaptation or mitigation or related activities like conservation and biodiversity and that kind of thing. The next slide will give you just a bit of an idea of a typical IDB project. So this is a project that was approved in late 2019. It's a $50 million project, so not huge by IDB standards, but representative of what the IDB is actually doing. So Ecuador came to the IDB saying, we're receiving large numbers of migrants, and we want to make sure that we can include them and their host populations, their host communities, in social services, including education and healthcare. And so the IDB works with Ecuador to design this intervention, this loan, essentially, that will respond to the needs of Ecuador and by nature kind of respond to the needs of migrants and host communities in Ecuador. And so even a relatively small project like this one provides significant consulting opportunities, both at the design and the implementation stage. So for example, at the design stage, when the IDB is working with Ecuador to design the loan, they might seek out consulting services to do a survey of educational methodologies for working with either on early childhood education or on remedial learning or kind of opportunities for students who have had their school year interrupted because of displacement. And then do a bit of an analysis on what models would be most appropriate for the Ecuadorian context. So that could be kind of an example of a consulting contract that would go out to tender for this type of project. And then when the project is being implemented, depending on kind of what's designed, you could have goods and works projects for the construction of clinics or schools, or the delivery of services and that kind of thing. And later on, I'll go into how Canadian firms can identify those specific types of consulting opportunities. I've included here in the next 2 slides just examples of projects that are financed by IDB Invest and IDB Lab. Nicola, I don't know if you could go ahead. There we go, thanks. So on the IDB Invest side, I won't go into it, but this is just kind of an example of IDB lending to a company, in this case in Uruguay, to do work that may not be as commercially attractive to a regular market because of the kind of intended development impact. And on the next slide, there's an example of an IDB Lab project. Again, where they've taken kind of an investment in a startup Haitian recycling company that's recycling ocean plastics. This project is interesting because there is a direct link to a Quebecois company as well. So there are opportunities, for Canadian companies to be partnering with some of the companies in Latin America and the Caribbean that are receiving investment and loans from IDB Lab and IDB Invest. On the next slide, a lot of people have asked about the COVID response and the impact of COVID on the IDB's operations. The Idb Group obviously, at the beginning of 2020, reacted quickly to support the needs of its members in terms of responding to COVID. And so you'll see there the sectors of priority that I identified. One of the things that I would observe is that there was a big public health response, but that wasn't the only element, and it's not the only element that the IDB is supporting in member countries in terms of their COVID response. There's been very much a focus on maintaining jobs, maintaining the provision of services to vulnerable populations and that kind of thing. So it's not like because of COVID, now all of the IDB spending is on the health side. It's been kind of a, through the approval of new operations and through the reformulation of some existing operations, there's a bit more on the health side, but it's very much kind of a comprehensive response. You'll see numbers there. So last year, the IDB lent $12.6 billion to borrowing countries, and IDB Invest $6.7 billion to the private sector. And one interesting and recently emerging element is that for 2021, the IDB has pledged to mobilize $1 billion to help countries in the region acquire and distribute vaccines. On the next slide, again, on the topic of COVID, so I think one of the things that's really important to underline is that the Latin America and Caribbean region has been the most hard-hit region, essentially, in the world by both the social and economic impacts of COVID. And so we're not quite out of that emergency phase yet. Still very much, it's still very much a public health and economic crisis. But the bank is also beginning to kind of look ahead at what the transition from the emergency response to an economic recovery will look like, and in particular, a green economic recovery. So looking at kind of how the region can build back better in a way that's sustainable and equitable for people. And so I've listed a few of kind of the, the emerging areas for recovery that may go into kind of, a medium-term plan. And I'd highlight there, just from a Canadian firm point of view, some of the opportunities in digitalization. That's including, digitalization of services, education, health, fintech. The climate and environmental sustainability aspect there as well, which the bank is quite committed to, and kind of responding to the impacts, the disproportionate impacts that the pandemic has had on women, on historically disadvantaged groups, and also on heavily impacted sectors like tourism. So that was kind of the IDB overview. Now I'd like to talk a bit more about business opportunities for Canadian firms and international firms with the Idb Group. Leah already covered why Canadian firms should be seeking opportunities with the IDB, so I won't go into this slide very much, but just to say it is a real access, an opportunity to access huge markets, both in the region and globally. And it's also an opportunity to have a positive impact on the development of the region. Next slide. How are Canadian firms doing at the IDB? Relatively well. So these are just kind of, and I'd say take all of these numbers with a bit of a, they're all approximations. But on average, Canadian firms win about 32 contracts a year with the IDB, averaging about $17 million per year. This represents anywhere between 0.4 and 0.7% of the total amount of bids and contracts. The countries listed there are the top countries for Canadian firms. What you will probably notice is that Canadian firms do really well and focus a lot on French-speaking countries in terms of Haiti and English-speaking countries in the Caribbean primarily, which is great because we have, linguistic affinities with those countries and they're close, and we have, lots of diaspora links as well. But I would also say that there are real untapped opportunities for Canadian firms in Spanish-speaking and Portuguese-speaking Latin America. This will give you just a bit of an idea of kind of the top participation sectors for Canadian firms. And you can see there that Canadian firms have been particularly successful in the last 4 years in the climate and environment space, and also on IT. The next slide talks a bit more about how Canadian firms are doing. The main takeaway here is that Canadian firms have a relatively high success rate compared to other non-borrowing countries when they're actually bidding on IDB contracts. So they have a success rate of about 43% for the bids that they're qualifying for, and that's slightly higher than the average in other non-borrowing countries. In the next slide, you'll see where so this is the origin countries for firms that have been successful on bids for the IDB, and this is from 2012 to the current day, so for the last 9 or 10 years. And what you'll see there is that of the top 10 countries, 8 of them are actually borrowing countries from the region. And this makes a lot of sense. Local firms have an advantage on IDB projects, on a lot of IDB projects. They've got, it's cheaper to kind of provide goods and works. They know the local markets, they speak the languages. Some procurement processes are nationally oriented as well. And so when we get down to the Canadian firms ranking, it's 28th. But when you look at that, just if you narrow it just to consulting services, Canada ranks 24th overall. So that's even better than some of the borrowing countries, and it ranks 4th among non-borrowers. So 2 takeaways from this slide that I'll go into later is that 1, we often suggest that Canadian firms consider partnering with a local firm in one of the borrowing member countries to increase their chances of success and to kind of take advantage of subcontracting opportunities. And also, Canadian firms tend to do better on the consulting side as opposed to the goods and works side. The next slide will reinforce that. So just in terms of kind of over the last 9 years or so, Canadian firms have done significantly better on consulting contracts than they have on goods. The next slide, Leah mentioned this a bit, but just when you're looking at opportunities in and with the IDB, it's useful to know that there are 3 types of procurement. The first is operational or project procurement, and that's where the bulk of the opportunities are. And as Leah mentioned, the IDB will often lend to a country, and that country will be delegated the procurement. So they'll run the procurement and the bids for a given project, but they have to comply with IDB procurement standards. The second element on bank executed operations, it's a smaller portion of the overall kind of procurement pie, but it can be interesting. It's the bank itself doing procurement, looking at consulting services primarily to inform its own work. And then corporate procurement is even a smaller piece of the pie, and it's focused primarily on providing, infrastructure and support services directly to the bank. But it can be interesting, particularly for IT companies that are looking to provide services directly to the bank. On the next slide, I really wanted to provide some hopefully useful tips for Canadian firms who are looking to move farther into this space and look at kind of consulting and possibly works, goods and works opportunities on IDB funded projects. So the first big tip here, I would say, is to take a longer term view. And I've put there scan and plan. The idea here is to essentially get to know the market and get to know the opportunities that are available there. And there are tons of resources that I'll talk about here where you can get that information. So there are subscription services like the UN Development Business Digest that can deliver kind of consulting opportunities and bid notices directly to your inbox. All of that information is also available on the IDB website, and I'll let you know in the following slides where you can actually access it. but that's great information. You can even be a bit more strategic and identify opportunities upstream. So before those actual notices come out, there's a wealth of information that can help you identify kind of what the bank is doing and what the country's priorities are. Country strategies, IDB country strategies outline what the bank plans to do in a given country over the next 4 or 5 years. And so that can be a real kind of help when you're looking at, how can you access these markets? So I would say in addition to that, assessment of what the market is and opportunities, identify you or your firm's competitive advantages there. And then do a bit of a matchup in terms of, what the opportunities are and where you think you can contribute. So for example, if you're an educational services company, and you want to work in Central America, you can look and see that, say in El Salvador, theoretically, education is a key priority over the next 5 years. And then you can start drilling down a little bit in terms of seeing, okay, what would be the actual opportunities there and how can I access them? And this gets into my second big point, which is reaching out and building relationships. We've seen in previous slides that local firms from borrowing countries tend to gain and win the bulk of both consulting and goods and works contracts. And so this actually presents a real opportunity for Canadian firms, either to, to work with those local companies, either via kind of joint bids or through subcontracting opportunities, that a local firm can kind of complement the specific competitive expertise and advantage of a Canadian firm. How can you identify those local partners? I think Canadian firms in ways have a leg up because you have the services of the Trade Commissioner Service that Leah Johnson, who spoke before me, represents. And you've got the PSLO network that Dina represents as well in Montreal. These services can help you kind of make the connections with local partners if you're interested in that. There's also a really good resource that's available for free to Canadian firms. It's called Connect Americas, and I'll give you the link later. It's actually an IDB platform that's meant to be kind of a business-to-business platform for making those connections and sharing information. I mentioned earlier that the IDB has country offices in all of the countries that it lends to. And if you as a Canadian firm have identified specific countries that you want to work in, those country offices can be a really good resource for getting information and sharing information about your own priorities. So we always recommend, if you've identified that you want to work in a particular country, whether it's Trinidad and Tobago or Ecuador or Argentina, if you're already working in the country, or if you have relationships with other businesses or organizations in that country, we recommend always reaching out to the local IDB country office in the spirit of kind of sharing information about what you're doing and also getting information about kind of IDB priorities in those countries. And again, so just kind of establishing that relationship, establishing that contact so that if something comes up, the IDB knows that you're there, and vice versa. You have some information about kind of where the IDB is planning on going. And I'd also mention that those IDB country offices represent not only the IDB, but also IDB Invest and IDB Lab. The next slide is the third tip. So essentially, if you've kind of done the homework and identified opportunities, and you're submitting a bid, it's really important, and you shouldn't hesitate to ask questions. If there are any kind of ambiguities in the bidding documents, reach out and ask questions to the executing agency, which would be identified in the document. again, if you're doing project procurement, it's usually the borrowing country that's responsible for procurement. So it might be a project unit within their Ministry of Finance or their Ministry of Education or Health or what have you. But clarify anything that's not clear. And the last thing that I would say is, if at first you don't succeed, learn from that initial experience and try again. You'll remember from a previous slide that Canadian firms have a 43% success rate in terms of the bids that they qualify for. And so take what you've learned from that previous bid and put it into a following bid or a follow-up kind of initiative. And as always with these things, it's easier once you have a first experience with an IFI like the IDB, then it's once you've established a track record, it can be easier for future bids. The next slide, it's just going back to that idea of kind of planning and scanning. This is the IDB project cycle at a very high level. So it gives you kind of the, those key input points where you can access the project documents. So at the beginning of a cycle, the country strategy is there. It's on the IDB website. I'll give you the link in the next slide. It identifies specific sectors and subsectors that the IDB will be financing in a given country. Farther along the line, there's the project pipeline and the project documents that include procurement plans. Those are also all available on the IDB website. And then when a project is actually approved and being executed, the specific procurement notices go out. And when an award or when a contract has been awarded, there's a notice that goes up in terms of identifying the country that has won the contract. And again, that's also good information for Canadian firms because those are potential partners for Canadian firms going forward. The next slide gives you the links for accessing all of those documents that were referenced in the previous slide. So in the long term, the country strategies, medium-term project documents and procurement plans, and the short-term, the specific procurement notices. And there's the link again for Banque executed operations. The next slide provides a few more links and additional resources for Canadian firms. So Connect Americas is the platform, the business-to-business platform that I mentioned. Again, free to access it. They did early on in the COVID pandemic, probably in April, they launched a COVID map that companies had access to that actually identified kind of businesses that had health-related services to provide. And so Canadian companies could register for that. So they'll do these kind of, sector and initiative-specific initiatives as well. So it's a really good resource for Canadian firms. I mentioned UN development business. There's the link there. There's a subscription fee that you have to pay, but depending on kind of your level of commitment to this, it can be really useful. Otherwise, the information is also available on the IDB website for free. And then at the bottom, you do have the IDB website with all of the information. There are also sector blogs on the IDB website, and that can be a really good resource for Canadian firms in terms of identifying, especially some of the emerging areas and emerging technologies that the bank is working with, and looking at how Canadian firms could contribute there. On the next slide, we've just provided as a closing, and this is the second last slide. These are just, looking at where the bank is going, where Canadian firms have done well. This is some analysis of sectors of emerging relevance for Canadian firms. And so renewable energy and clean tech is an area that we've been strong on and that I think will be an area of continued focus and growth for the bank, along with environmental services and technologies. I mentioned digitalization and kind of the rise of digital services as being really important in the region. And so we see that in terms of telehealth, distance education, financial, digital financial services, and other types of IT type support that Canadian companies have been really strong on. And those will continue to be a real area, I think, of opportunity at the bank. And then more broadly and kind of cross-cutting, management and consulting services. Canadian firms have always been, quite strong and quite well respected, I think, on consulting services related to infrastructure and transportation and water and sanitation and wastewater treatment and that kind of thing. And that's an area that's going to be, it's among the main lines of business of the bank and will continue to be. Finally, on the next slide, I just wanted to mention there are also, in addition to the procurement and consulting opportunities that I've focused on today, there are co-investment opportunities for the IDB Group. If your company is an investor, the IDB Invest often acts as a broker for transactions in supporting companies in the region. And so there are opportunities for private investors and institutional investors to co-invest with IDB Invest and with IDB Lab as well. I won't get into those opportunities very much today, but there is an upcoming webinar on investment opportunities in March or April that Dina can let you know about when it's confirmed. So with that, I would just say thank you. On the next slide, you'll have my email address. You can feel free to reach out to me. And I would definitely encourage you to be in contact with Leah Johnson with any questions as well. Her office, the Office of Liaison with IFIs, we usually consider kind of the first line of contact for Canadian firms that are interested in doing business with either the IDB or the World Bank. And they've got great resources and a great network, but you can also feel free to copy me on anything, any issues or any questions that you might have about the IDB itself. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, and open to any questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Darren and Leah as well. So I invite everyone who has a question to write it in the Q&A box. We've already received some questions, so I'll start. So I think, Cassandra Pichette asked if it's possible to receive the contact information for IDB. I believe, Darren, you just showed it now. Just as a reminder for everyone, we'll also send you the slides. So if you couldn't write down some of the contact information or any of the other resources that Darren or Leah mentioned, you will receive everything by email tomorrow. So thank you, Cassandra, and yes, we can also as well make sure we can contact you for more information. Another question we have from Elliot Garfinkel. So I think this question is more towards Leah. So he'd like to have more details on trade commissional services and the PSLO network services, not only creating the local connections, but more importantly, vetting them as being trustworthy and validating the expertise and specialty track record on the services that the local partners claim they can perform.
Sure. So that's a great question. So one of our services is like what Elliot was saying, was kind of providing Canadian firms with information on local companies that are active in a specific sector or specific country, and kind of making those connections as needed. I would say ultimately we can provide resources on the companies that are available, but it is still up to the company to provide their own due diligence. But there are a lot of resources that are available. Darren mentioned it, but the IDB, World Bank, all the major IFIs publish contract award data. And that's on the operational, corporate and bank executed operational side as well. Typically it's over the threshold of 250,000 US, but recently they've just been publishing contract award data that's below that as well. So you can see which companies are active, which ones are winning the projects. and consider those as potential partners. And I always encourage companies to look at that. And the other resources, if you're trying to understand if a company has, if you think there's something wrong with the company, or you're trying to understand if this company is allowed to bid on projects, the IDB, the World Bank, they all have offices of institutional integrity, where they address concerns around corruption, fraud, and there are lists of firms that have been sanctioned, and you can see which firms are not allowed, and it'll give information on what the, if it's a debarment, if it's a sanction, whatever it is, you can find some information there. And that's all publicly available information. And I can include the links when we send out the information in the email tomorrow with the PowerPoints and everything. So I hope that answered it.
Thank you, Leah. So on the same kind of question, was it this time from Bart Edes? So this question will be more towards Darren on the same kind of view. So also, how does IDB address the risk of corruption and unethical behavior in procurement? Unfortunately, in Latin America and Caribbean countries fare poorly on the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index.
Great, thanks for the question. So yeah, Leah touched on it a little bit, but the IDB actually, takes the issue of corruption, the possibility of corruption in procurement very seriously. So when it's deciding, we mentioned that kind of for project procurement, the IDB will often delegate procurement responsibility to the borrowing country, to a specific unit within the borrowing country. It doesn't always do that. And so there's a methodology called MAPS that the IDB, it's actually kind of a global methodology that the IDB and other IFIs apply to assess the procurement system of borrowing countries and determine, whether there's a risk of, whether there are integrity risks there. And if there are, the IDB actually has a programming line to build the capacity of national procurement systems in the region. But if that risk is judged to be too high, then the IDB will do the procurement itself, at least kind of in the short term, to avoid kind of any undue integrity risks. The other thing I'd mention, and just to echo Leah, is that, if there are any allegations of unethical behavior, the IDB has the Office of Institutional Integrity that will look at any kind of allegations or complaints and assess them. And even when the IDB, the rationale behind that is that even when the IDB does delegate procurement to the borrowing country, the IDB still has a role in terms of ensuring compliance with the IDB procurement policies, which is a best practice policy that obviously, prioritizes integrity and transparency and value for money, among other things. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. The next question from Stanley Kwan. He's asking, is there any international financial institution assistance, both in terms of financial and market development, to Canadian organic food companies, more specifically Quebec companies in Central American and Caribbean countries? Maybe Leah, you can start with this one.
Sure. So I'm not sure that I understand the question perfectly, but if you're asking if there are opportunities for IDB investment, I'm not positive of ones in organic food companies, but that's definitely something that we can look into. I mean, typically, if there's someone who says they have an opportunity and they're looking for investment or other financial tools, we'll find the person within IDB Invest who covers that sector or that country, and then they can start to have those conversations I'm more of a kind of IDB institution expert rather than a sector expert, so I wouldn't want to speak to kind of the food and agricultural team without knowing everything. But Darren, I don't know if there was anything you wanted to add there.
It's a good question, and it's, I think, a growing area of focus. Agricultural technologies, organic food, and local or regional supply chains are all areas that we assess will be continue to be important and growing. I'm not sure of any IDB assistance to Canadian companies, again, because the IDB focus and the IDB Invest and IDB Lab focus is on countries and companies from Latin America and the Caribbean. But the opportunities for Canadian firms there might be in partnering with companies of the region, in Central America and the Caribbean that are receiving investments from IDB Invest or IDB Lab. So I think that would be kind of the point, the most lucrative point of contact with the IDB in that area.
Also, I just wanted to add one thing that actually, thank you to Norm Looker for reminding me, is that the Trade Commissioner Service does provide some market support through CAN Export for market development. That's done at our regional office. So we have a regional office in Montreal and Quebec City, and we can connect you to our colleagues, but they can explain the programs around what type of financing or what type of programs that they support. And I know that with the pandemic, they're doing more on virtual marketing or virtual tools that companies need to export. So I'm not sure who asked that question, but I would say connect with me and I can connect you to our regional office who can tell you about those programs.
Thank you. Our next question, someone is interested at doing business in Cuba, but notice it's not a member of IDB. So just wondering if there's any plans to add Cuba eventually.
It's a great question. There aren't any short-term plans to add Cuba. The IDB is, in addition to being its own independent body, it's a member of the interamerican system, which is kind of regulated by, in some sense, the Organization of American States. And Cuba is not a member of the Organization of American States. And so, as such, it's not a member of the IDB. Who knows how that will change in the short to medium term. But right now, it's not a member of the IDB.
Thank you. So the next one is in French, and I think it's a little long. So I'll start by reading it in French. And Darren, I think you can also read it as well in the Q&A box. But I'll start. So, and then I'll translate in English for everyone. So it's from Albert Albala. So his question is, okay. So him and, okay, donc deux firmes québécoises et lui montant avec une ONG haïtienne un projet dans le domaine de l'énergie renouvelable et des déchets, de réduction et mitigation climatique. Le projet a besoin de dons dans sa première phase et on s'attend à une rentabilité en phase 2. Le risque est trop élevé pour un financement purement privé. Est-ce que IDB Lab ou IDB Invest serait une ressource appropriée pour un investissement de départ, pour du seed money, ou un investissement risqué à long terme? Si oui, à quel taux d'intérêt vous attendez-vous? So I'll translate in English. So he's working with two firms from Quebec as well as a NGO from Haiti for a project in renewable energy and waste management and climate. The project needs donations and funding for its first phase. and they think that they'll get return on investment on phase 2. The risk is too high for a private financing, purely private financing for the first phase. Is IDB Lab or IDB Invest a resource that will be appropriate as an initial investment for seed money or for more risk investment in long term? And if so, if that could be an option, what kind of interest rates could they provide?
Moi, je pourrais peut-être répondre si ça vous convient. Donc, ouais, c'est un projet assez intéressant. Puis oui, en fait, je vous inviterai à faire un suivi directement avec moi et je pourrais vous mettre en contact avec un collègue de l'IA, Fahim Nourali, qui est le spécialiste en climat puis énergie renouvelable. Mais oui, ça pourrait être quelque chose que IDB Lab ou IDB Invest pourrait financer. IDB Lab, c'est plutôt des investissements d'équité, donc pas nécessairement des prêts. IDB Invest, c'est plutôt des prêts. Il y a une petite fenêtre pour faire des investissements équité, mais en fait, c'est plutôt des prêts. Le taux d'intérêt, ça se calcule différemment pour chaque transaction, mais normalement, les taux d'intérêt sont très favorables. C'est moins, disons, pour un projet en IT, ça serait moins de ce que le taux d'intérêt serait sur le marché normal. Mais ouais, c'est quelque chose qui pourrait être intéressant. Donc, s'il vous plaît, faire un suivi avec moi. Je vous mettrai en contact avec les personnes ressources pertinentes à IDB Lab ou à IDB Invest. Merci.
Merci. Alors, merci beaucoup, Darren. Thank you, Darren. Thank you, Leah. So we're now at the end of the question period. It's 11, so we'll close the webinar for now. I see we received a lot of questions. So for everyone whose question was not answered, I'll make sure to send them to Darren and Leah, and maybe we can follow up with you on a personal note. So again, so thank you for your great presentation, Darren and Leah. And as a reminder, so once again, I invite you to complete the survey that will be sent to you. It will pop up on your browser. It will be very appreciated to make sure you like our activities and we get your comments. The video recording for today will be available on our website this week. And so I once again just want to thank all of our partners, so Desjardins, EDC, La Presse, as well as Economic Development Agency of Canada for the region of Quebec. And well, thank you everyone. On behalf of the Chamber of Commerce of Metropolitan Montreal, I wish you all a good day and hope to see you at our next events.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Merci tout le monde.